All right, so for my talk on early Quaker spirituality, I'd first like to give a tiny bit of historical context, then speak about just a few scattered notable people in early Quaker history. I'll also make connections with early Quakerism and the first UU principle, the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Early Quakers followed many UU principles, but we'll just stick to that one for today. I'll also speak of the spiritual path of early Quakers and answer the question of whether this path can inform our own spirituality and quest for justice, which I believe is yes. So first, on the historical context. The early Quaker movement began about 135 years after Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Church of the Door on Wittenberg with his cry of sola scriptura, or scripture only, which began the Protestant Reformation. So 17 years later, this event would lead to the founding of the Church of England with the English monarch at its head. And the next 100 years after that, England would see the Puritans emerge as not only a religious force, but a political force, just as the Church of England had, the English king and politics there. The Puritans would lend their support to Parliament's side in the English Civil War. And that would be victorious for Parliament. The king would be beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell would step up to not the throne, but the presidency, whatever you want to call it. His title was Lord Protector. So it was during those years of the English Civil War, actually, that a young man named George Fox began to wander about England looking for spiritual answers. So he found the religion at the time to be empty. I mean, after all, he thought the priests, both sides of the faith, you might call it in that day, and even the Catholics had, lended their support to one side of the Civil War. So Christianity at large were taking up arms, in the name of a Jesus who had said, "Lay down your sword." So George Fox saw the hypocrisy in this and other hypocrisies. But he wasn't only seeing it outside of himself. He began to believe that it was in him as well, and he wanted it rooted out of him. But he felt he couldn't find it, in all the different religious sects at the time. And so this really disheartened him, and he wasn't quite sure what to do. One word he used, he wanted to find someone who could speak to his condition. And what he meant by that was that he didn't need someone to just get up on a pulpit and just quote words of scripture. If he was gonna remove himself from the hypocrisy he saw all around him and to root it out of himself, he needed someone with real authority to use the words of scripture, or their own words, in a way that would help him, in a way that would teach him how to live right without this hypocrisy that he saw around him. But after much searching, he began to give up hope that he'd ever find such an individual. So I'm going to quote from his journal. He writes this: "I had given up on the priests and also left the separate preachers and those called the most experienced people. For I saw there was none among them all that could speak to my condition. And when all my hopes in them and in all men were gone, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, nor could anyone tell me what to do, then I heard a voice which said, 'There is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to your condition.' When I heard it, my heart leapt for joy." So this was in 1648 that he writes about. So with this and other revelations, Fox, and eventually others too, would start a religion based on this direct communication with God that Fox had experienced, he said, out in the field that day. And they could all be heard proclaiming all throughout England and eventually beyond this rallying cry that Christ has come to teach his people himself. The early Quakers, they traveled extensively delivering this message. They said that their preaching worked the same way, as I just mentioned, as the revelation of Fox, as I had just described. They said their message was from immediate inspiration, from a living light within. In fact, they maintained this inner light was more important than the scriptures, which so many other Protestants held so dear. Quakers didn't deny the scriptures. They believed them to be divinely inspired too. But the difference between other Protestants and Quakers is that the Quakers maintained that other movements at the time were picking and choosing scriptures to justify their own beliefs and prejudices. Instead of following this inner living light until they arrived at a place where they were one with the same spirit that helped the prophets and apostles of old pen those scriptures of antiquity, and could similarly help them speak and pen words that were just as inspired for the present day. The point is illustrated in an oft-told Quaker story from the perspective of Margaret Fell, who would later marry George Fox and was often called the mother of Quakerism. George Fox once came into the Puritan church, which Fell and her family attended. Fox asked permission to speak and was given it. One of the things he said, which I'll say in our own modern English for some clarity, was this: the scriptures were the prophets' words and Christ's and the apostles' words, and the things that they spoke of, they enjoyed and possessed and had it from the Lord. You will say, Christ says this and the apostles say that, but what can you say? Are you a child of the light? Have you walked in the light? And what you speak, is it inwardly from God? These words were offensive to many, and Fox was thrown out of the church. Some people were interested, and he began to teach them in the graveyard of the church. So it basically, he challenged people's profession, people's integrity, people's sincerity, and this was too much. In fact, Fox wasn't in prison that day, but he'd spend 7 years of his life in prison for challenging people in this way. And these people didn't like it, and they committed him to prison, as well as many, many other Quakers, as I'll speak about a little bit more as well. But as I mentioned, by the people that did gather around him in the graveyard, although it was a challenge to some, it was precious to others. And so I'll quote also Margaret Fell, who recounts this story. When she had heard Fox begin to speak, she rose to her feet thinking, I've never quite heard a message like this from the Puritans before. And after he was done, she said, this opened me so that it cut to the heart. And then I saw clearly we were all wrong. So I sat down on my pew again and cried bitterly. And I cried in my spirit to the Lord, we are all thieves, we're all thieves. We have taken the scriptures and words and know nothing of them in ourselves. Fell would later come to a place where she no longer felt a thief of the words of the scripture, but one who tried to preserve them. And there are many issues that she spoke on. I'll just mention one for today. It was on the subject of whether or not women could be ministers of God. She published a pamphlet called Women Speaking Justified. Fell, along with many Quakers, were making good use of Gutenberg's printing press, as well as other religious sects, to put forth what they believed was true. So in her pamphlet, Fell argued that the whole of the New Testament put women on men on equal footing. She made this a point from many examples of scripture. I'll just give two. And one example, she pointed out the risen Christ chose to appear to women first, commanding them to go tell the male apostles, and that the male apostles didn't even believe them until they saw him for themselves. Also, she pointed out Paul, the author of most of the New Testament, declared, there is no male or female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus. And Fell wasn't the only Quaker to take this position. Every Quaker took the same position, and many female as well as male Quakers would preach this and write this in other pamphlets, including George Fox and others. Therefore, the Quakers as a whole argued for the inherent worth and dignity of women as equal to men, which we as Unitarians enshrine as our first principle. Concerning the equality of the sexes is not the only place they would apply the first principle. They also affirm the inherent worth and dignity for the commoner as equal to the aristocrat. They refused to take part in many of the customs of the time that treated the rich and poor differently. For example, in 17th century England, it was customary, if I were to see someone that was of higher social rank than I would take off my hat, what they call doffing your hat. I would bow low, and I would actually refer to these people with different pronouns that I would use to refer to as my equals. But the reverse was not the case. Someone of a higher rank would not be expected to do this to me. And the Quakers would have none of these traditions that affirm the worth and dignity of some over others. And by refusing to do these things and and proclaim that you're better than me, you're better than us, the higher person is better than the servant. For refusing that, many Quakers were imprisoned. Now, another act that the Quakers were imprisoned for was for not paying the mandatory tithes to the state church, the Church of England. The Quakers believed that the Inner Light's view on the matter, and the Bible's for that matter, was that Jesus and his apostles preached freely. No one was coerced to provide their livelihood for them, and so no one should be coerced to maintain a church today. And their goods were confiscated for this. Many were imprisoned. Many died in prison because in English prisons in those days, there's no heat. Wintertime, it got very cold. There were disease-ridden times, and if you didn't have the money to pay for it, you didn't eat. So many would die in the prisons. So I'm gonna turn a little bit now in my speech and kind of talk about some of my reflections. I've read many Quaker journals from this time, and there are common themes. So some started out prejudiced against the Quakers due to rumors circulating they were horrible people. But when these Quakers to be heard the Quakers speak, they liked them. Not everybody liked them, as I just said, some threw them in prison, but these people that would later, convert to Quakerism, as you might say, they heard these people were peaceful, they were just, they were kind. They spoke of the possibility of a direct living relationship with God. So these particular non-Quakers went to hear them more and more, until one day one of them might be walking down the street, see a person that's of a socially higher rank than them. Something inside them would say, "Don't take off your hat and bow." There's a great story of William Penn, the famous Quaker, refusing to take off his hat and bow to the King of England and refer to him in the proper pronoun. But obviously the acts like this, there were consequences. You could go to prison. So, but these Quakers in the journals that I read, so sometimes their fear would get the better of them. They wouldn't do it. And then they would have this pang in their conscience, right? They didn't have joy. But when they finally mustered up the courage to perform this act or another one, not paying their tithes, etc., they had this inner joy and they felt so good. And often this process was kind of repeated as the stakes got higher and higher. So for example, now I'm going to kind of shift the conversation to the United States. The Quakers, many Quakers moved to the United States. Under Boston's Puritan government, there was a law passed in 1658 that if any Quaker who was not an inhabitant of the colony was found there, they would be imprisoned and, if proven to be a Quaker, would be immediately executed. And just as Quakers had refused to bow or pay tithes, despite the risk of being imprisoned, many also refused to stay clear of Boston despite this high risk of death. The first three to be convicted under this law and sent to the gallows were William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson, and Mary Dyer in 1659. Dyer walked hand in hand with the two men after they had been sentenced on their way to the gallows and between them. She was publicly asked about what was deemed this inappropriate closeness between the sexes at the time. She responded instead to her sense of the event, and those words are recorded. That's one thing I want to note that's interesting in studying, early Quaker history, that, all of this rich history is written for us in our own language, in English. So it's really fascinating. So she said this: "It is an hour of the greatest joy I can enjoy in this world. No eye can see, no ear can hear, no tongue can speak, no heart can understand the sweet incomes and refreshings of the Spirit of the Lord, which I now enjoy." I should say, in my language at least. I know not everybody has English as a native language. But learning about other religious movements like the early Christianity, there's this idea that you would need to know Greek, or some people argue that at least. So this is a very rich history for the English speakers. Back to the Quaker history. Mary watched from the gallows as her two friends were hung, expecting to be next. However, a letter from her son asking for her pardon was received, and so instead she was placed on a ship and sent to England. Now she came back the first chance she got, and this time she was hung. When her sentence was read, and the man, Captain John Webb, who read it, said that she was guilty of her own blood, Dyer's response was this: "Nay, I came to keep blood guiltiness from you, desiring you to repeal the unrighteous and unjust law of banishment upon pain of death, made against the innocent servants of the Lord. Therefore my blood will be required at your hands who willfully do it. But for those that do it in the simplicity of their hearts, I do desire the Lord to forgive them. I came to do the will of my Father, and in obedience to his will, I stand even to the death." About a year later, the last of the four so-called Boston martyrs, William Ledger, was hung. During his trial, another Quaker, Wenlock Christison, appeared in court and warned the Puritan governor, John Endicott, to overturn the law. For that, Christensen was also sentenced to death. But this time with disagreement among the magistrates who decided the case. There was disagreement among them because the public sentiment in seeing the calmness and hearing the words of the last four who had been killed, it led to increasing opposition for the anti-Quaker law. Nevertheless, his sentence was read, and on hearing it, he warned the court thusly: Do not think to weary out the living God by taking away the lives of his servants. What do you gain by it? For the last man that you put to death here are 5 come in his room. And if you have power to take my life from me, God can raise up the same principle of life in 10 of his subjects and send them among you in my room, that you may have torment. Now this philosophy is how the Quakers grew. No matter what the cost, the Quakers didn't stop speaking against and disobeying what they found to be unjust. People saw their ability to suffer for what they believed in. They witnessed their nonviolence, their patience and joy amidst suffering, and came to the conclusion that these Quakers were on the right side of the matter. In this particular case, the English king, the monarchy having been reestablished by this time, was convinced that the Quakers were right after having been visited by Quaker Edward Burrough back in England and ordered to end the executions. So with their calmness and strong conviction, even in the face of death, Quakers changed the tide of both public and governmental opinion. Their influence didn't end with the 17th century. I'm going to be very, very brief here. They'd be instrumental in overturning slavery in England. They became the first Christian denomination in the US to adopt a policy that you could not be Quaker and also own slaves. During World War II, they were among the few groups to publicly support and aid the 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry who were interned in camps across the US. And much more could be said throughout the long Quaker history. But I wanted to move in the brief moments we have to the question of how does it apply to us? Perhaps all of us would like to be able to look death in the face with calm and even joy because we're following a course that we believe will improve our world and change history for the best. I know I would. But how do we get there? And I'd love to wait for the post-service discussion to have this discussion. But since this is a talk in early Quaker spirituality, let me attempt to give the early Quaker answer as I understand it. So, and one last anecdote in order for me to present this. The Quakers often refer to a story in the Bible told from Peter's perspective in his epistle when he, Jesus, and John and James were on a mountain. They had seen Jesus' face become as bright as the sun. They heard a voice that said, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased." Moses and Elijah appeared on each side of Jesus. And as glorious and miraculous as this all sounds, Peter wrote, "We also have a more sure word of prophecy than this voice, which I heard with my own ears. And this more sure word you do well to heed, as into a light that shines in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star, the sun, arise in your hearts." So to illustrate the Quaker perspective on this, as I said, I'm offering one last Quaker anecdote. George Fox had once walked into a Protestant church where the minister was reading from this very passage. The minister said that this more sure word of prophecy was the scriptures. Now, Fox said, unlike the last story I told when Fox asked permission to speak, he said that the God's power was so strong in him, he couldn't keep silence. but he cried out, "Oh no, it's not the scriptures." And he told them instead it was the Holy Spirit by which holy men of God had given forth the scriptures. And he reminded his all Christian audience that it was the very keepers of the scriptures in Christ's day who had demanded his crucifixion. So the Holy Spirit, Fox and the other Quakers said, was that inner light that shines in a dark place that Peter mentioned, telling us right from wrong, telling us not to do wrong, but either by committing a wrong act or by refusing to stand up for a wrong act, stand up against a wrong act, as the Quakers did. And if we fail to act, as I guess I mentioned before, it convicts us and gives us a chance to right our wrong. And then we wake up the next day, and there's a whole other set of circumstance that the inner light has something to say about. And then it gets easier and more difficult at the same time, right? Because more difficult because maybe first I'm faced with losing a friend by offending him and not, maybe the friends of a higher social class. I know he's not going to throw me in prison, but I'm going to lose a friend. But then, well, now maybe I'll be thrown in prison for this next thing. Now maybe I'll be put to death. So it's getting harder. But they testify that it gets easier because the light grows more and more and more until one day that sun arises in their hearts, right? And dozens of Quakers that I've looked at testify of this. And I think Mary Dyer is a great example. Her face was the one, if you all got the email or saw the website, it was that picture of her being led to the gallows with kind of like an angel, right? Face bright. We heard her words of how peaceful and joyful she was in that hour. It was her darkest hour outwardly, but inwardly, she testified it was her brightest. The day star had risen for her, and no level of darkness could snuff it out. And the very last point, Quakers also referred to this day star rising as the return of Christ. While other Christians of the day looked for some outward visible return, sometimes political return, right? They said there was no such thing. They testified that he had already returned in tens of thousands of them throughout Britain and the entire world, and that his living presence in them was brighter than any darkness that they could experience. So thank you. Eric and John Michaels are actually going to play our offertory song for us now. "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple." You'll recognize the tune as the one that Carolyn just played. So if you wish to give this morning, please take these few moments to do so. And the different methods by which you may give will be displayed on the screen for you. Hopefully everyone will see it. Some of us in the ramping up to this had a little trouble seeing it, but it should come onto your screen briefly. And as Sally reminds everyone, please give generously as you're able. Okay, Eric and John. Sally, you have that, right? You're going to share that?
Yes, I'm getting ready to share it right now.
Cool. Just want to make sure we're on the same page.
members and friends of the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. I want to lift up in prayer the events that happened this past week at the Capitol. I was shocked and stunned as I watched it live from my apartment. I want to lift up in prayer all of the families of those
Sorry, I was having a little trouble getting it up, but I think I can do it. Just give me 1 second.
Are you going to restart this, Sally?
I could also read, she did send this sounds like a longer version, but I do have originally, we were deciding whether she was just going to pass on the words for one of us to share or play the tape. So Sally, do you think I should just go ahead and read what she had sent on her behalf?
My problem, I think I was unmuted. I was muted. Is that, you couldn't hear it, right? Could you see it?
Right. We could see it.
Okay, let's
so
try.
We'll try the tape one more time.
Okay, sorry
and then
about
if that doesn't
this,
work,
folks.
okay.
members and friends of the Unitarian Church of Staten Island. I want to lift up in prayer the events that happened this past week at the Capitol. I was shocked and stunned as I watched it live from my apartment. So I want to lift up in prayer all of the families of those who were affected, all the family members of those in Congress, the people who attempted the coup, those who are hurt and injured. I also lift up in prayer the heart of our representation, the heart of our representative democracy. We know that change is still underway as we watch as Georgia turned blue, as more Black voters and Black voter engagement than has ever happened before in Georgia has been made known by the work of Black activists and more. I lift up our own community as I look around and I see the values of democracy and diplomacy among our neighbors here on Staten Island. Because of all of these things, because of this community and our own values of democracy, of making sure every voice heard, every life. I know that a future of peace and pluralism is possible. May it be so. Amen.
All right, I think yeah, that ends our service. And yeah, so welcome, I guess, to the post-service discussion where we can continue the conversation that we've already started. I mean, maybe I'll start because I promised Mike, asked about Richard Nixon in the post-service discussion. I'll give a maybe another early Quaker answer. Sorry, I'm wearing that hat today. But it reminded me of another pamphlet of Margaret Fell, or I don't know if she was Margaret Fell or Margaret Fox by that time, wrote about the later so early generations of Quakers. They thought, why spend our money on fashion, right? So they just wore the clothes they had, and it went out of fashion, and then someone else, they didn't buy new clothes. And then Margaret Fell 30 years later said, why are you buying clothes from 30 years ago? You should just wear the clothes that you have now. So in other words, instead of like it being a principled thing that I'm not going to spend my money on fashion, like the later generations of Quakers would start to buy the clothes to look like the people who had those principles to begin with. And it wasn't just the clothing issue. There was this idea that people were becoming Quakers in name only. And so perhaps, I mean, if it happened in Fell's day, I mean, there are different strands of Quakerism that went off the original intent. So perhaps Mike Richard Nixon was one of those, buying the clothes from 30 years ago and not one of the ones that was making a principled stand. Anyway, perhaps.
Thank you for that, because I don't think I ever heard him actually refer to himself as a Quaker during any of his time in office. So perhaps your description applies.
I want to say I enjoyed the service, and Dave, Zoom, I find Zoom really weird and I really don't like it that much, but it was kind of fun to be focused on your face because I could see the joy you had in doing this, and it was very nice. So thank you for pulling the service together and for looking so cheerful about it.
Dave, I had a question about how you got interested in Quakers. Is it something you recently researched, or have you looked at it over many years?
So great question. It's kind of actually Quaker-esque how I got interested, because this will happen to me sometimes. I had a thought one day to Google, I wish I remember the phrase, but I feel like it was something like the kingdom of God is here today. It was something along those lines. And I Googled it, and the first page that came up was something about the Quakers. And I started reading it, and then I never stopped. I mean, I don't know, I grew up Christian. I feel I had never really heard of the Quaker. I mean, I heard of them, but I never knew what they were about until I had Googled that phrase and started reading. And I felt like what I found was both reconciled my upbringing and what I believed, today. So it was a great merging of the two. So that's how I got interested. And I guess because it has those Christian roots that I grew up in, and all, but also the spirit of where I'm more at. I just can't get enough of it. I read it. I just go through. There's so much to read. I mean, it never stops. Even from those first 40 years, you would take maybe not a lifetime to read it all, but there's a lot. So yeah, that's the end.
Yeah, I think that Unitarians and Quakers have had a symbiotic relationship. Not that I'm a student of either, but we've had Quakers in our congregation, and in the peace movement also. The Quakers have been so important to it. The war resistors who don't pay their taxes for the war machine, they may not be Quakers, but they follow that Quaker tradition that you talked about of taking big, believing something and following through on it and resisting. It's like they're not doffing their hat
Right.
to the aristocrats. So it's a really rich history, and wonderful that you brought it from the beginning to us.
Also, in contemporary time, if you take a trip to Newport, Rhode Island, you can go to Truro Synagogue, which is the oldest synagogue in the United States. It's beautiful, it's an absolutely beautiful building. And of course you can, have a guided tour or a self-guided tour. And then you can go a very short walk away to see where the original Quaker meeting house was. That meeting house was closed for many, many, many years because, of course, the Quaker population in Newport, Rhode Island, gradually declined. My mother-in-law became very involved with the restoration, which it is now. And her memorial service was the first event held there after it was restored and reopened again. And so it has very special meaning for us. But again, it's a beautiful a piece of, well, I won't call it a piece of architecture. It's a beautiful building, very simple. I mean, that's the whole point about the Quaker philosophy is to be simple, is to be plain. My mother-in-law always used to say to me, Ruthie, do you think that I'm plain? Do you think this suit is plain enough? I'm going to put a little tiny bit of lipstick on. Do you think that's okay? So, she really harked back to that tradition. Also spoke in the familiar. So not so much with me, but with her children, which was, Fishy, thee needs to pick thy socks up right now. She told, I don't really just do this one more thing and then you go, I'll take the floor. But she told me the story. She was a very rambunctious child in a very sort of staid, rather large Quaker household in Germantown. And one of the things that would happen is when she would rush into dinner, she'd always sort of bypass and kick her mother's chair. And her mother was very stern and very decorous. And at one point, my mother-in-law told me the story. At one point she said, her name was Fisher, Esther Fisher. She said, Fishy, if thee kicks my chair one more time, I don't know what I'm going to do. And Ruthie, do you know what? My foot just went right out and kicked that chair. End of story.
While I think of it, I wanted to thank George Finger, who's here with us, because George, well, first of all, when he gave his talk and in the after service discussion, the right and left brain thing reminded me of like the Quaker inspiration from God thing, so I shared a couple of Quaker stories, and later George said, maybe you wrote it in the comments, I don't remember. He said, why don't you do a talk on early Quaker spirituality? So that comment of George was the reason why I gave this in the first place. And number two, I actually gave 2 other versions of this on Zoom to him this week. So he helped me practice this and work the kinks out. So I'm thankful to you, George, for that.
That's really interesting. It was a collaboration in a way. That's great. Well, next door where I live on Hamilton Avenue, across from Curtis High School, was a Quaker meeting house where Roger Dreisbach Williams and his wife Liesel lived. I don't know if any of you remember that. We moved here in '79 and they moved away in the early '80s. But there was a small Quaker meeting held in that house regularly. And I did go once there, and I've been to other Quaker meetings too, off and on. But yeah, so I think then Betsy Wilson, she was part of the Quaker meeting, and there was a Quaker meeting held up in West Brighton by the park up there, Hart Avenue on the other side of, I'm trying to remember the woman's name. She was a Quaker also. I think she may still be there. So we have Quakers still in Staten Island. And maybe they have regular meetings.
Right before COVID, there was a monthly meeting at Makerspace.
Oh, okay. So, yeah.
When Ruth, when you told your story, it reminded me, because originally I had the idea of the singular and the plural you pronouns. I tried to explain that, and George Finger advised me, like, it's kind of too confusing. But since you bring it up, I feel like maybe, because this interested me. So apparently, like, to us, if I say thou, hallowed be thy name, like that, using that words, it sounds more formal, but actually in the 1600s, that was informal. That was the singular pronoun. So I grew up, I see Mariana, she obviously speaks Spanish, like I grew up learning French in high school. And, we would say tu if you're talking to one person and vous if you're talking to many. So the Quakers, so back in 400, maybe you all know this, I don't know, but why not? Like back 400 years ago, I would say thou if I was referring to Ruth. I'm just looking at you right now for some reason. And I would say you if I'm referring to all of you or two or three of you. And the Quakers said that this is actually what's written in our English grammar books. But I don't know how it started, but at some point, some individual thou person decided that, well, I'm more than an individual, so I should be referred to as a you. Another, like, I've heard that term, the royal we, right? Like this idea that that makes me somehow I'm better than all of you, so you need to at least refer to me as two or more, because I'm so that's what the Quakers were railing against. They're like, no, I'm going to refer to you as a singular person, as I read in this grammar book. And as I said, for that they were often imprisoned.
They're using,
but I guess
they're using the familiar. So that thing that you were saying about the egalitarian thing, what we don't doff our hats. So we refer to you, you are not above us. We do not use formal you, and we use what we would say to our children or to our, our partners. It's thee and thou. They don't use thou so much anymore, but it's thee and thine. If thee doesn't pick up thine socks, or no, thy, they don't say thine, sorry, that's archaic. If thee doesn't pick up thy socks, but it's not so much thou or thine. That I don't know what form that would be. It's mostly thee and thy. Thee and thy is what they use now, and perhaps always. I don't know. That I don't know.
Well, that and the story about people originally just wearing their old clothes and then buying old clothes reminded me of the Hasidic Jews who dressed originally in the 1600s. They were dressing like Polish noblemen and in protest because you couldn't wear those knickers and those hats and those socks in a way of protest, but they just kept buying them, right? And it became the way that they looked, just like Quaker gray and Quaker parrots, which are gray, and thee and thou, and yeah.
That raises lots of questions about, do you keep up with the times or not?
Yeah.
And what does that mean when you don't? Is that I don't know, it's a very interesting challenge as you get older, like it seems children force you always to keep up with changes and language changes and cultural changes. And that seems like a good thing, not to stay stuck.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, maybe the pandemic is teaching us to stick with our old clothes. I mean, who's shopping, who's buying clothes now? Nobody, because who cares? This is the only part we ever see. So, you can wear your baggy pants and you can wear this thing that you've had for 12 years. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I definitely think keeping up with time, I mean, it's keeping up with the times is the way to go. And maybe I'm being repetitive, but it reminds me of that, pamphlet by Margaret Fell that you're supposed to so that was our, wearing this was our protest 20 years ago, but you got to come up with a new protest, it's not like what's current. I feel like that's the spirit of Quakerism that, like I said, that even 30 years later, a lot of them were crying out against, like, you're losing the spirit. And in fact, they would talk about this when the early Quakers, right, when they're talking about the other Christian groups, that they had retreated back into these forms. You know, they were doing these rituals, doing these things, and they had no more meaning. So the Quakers said the meaning for today is making these stands. Women and men are equal. Aristocrat and commoner are equal. You know, and so their actions depended on the matter of the moment. And then they were saying, hey, the same thing is happening to us Quakers that happened to these other Protestant groups. We have to keep up. We gotta don't make an idol out of, you know, out of the meeting house or out of the clothes or what have you, you know, but be, you know, as was it Ruth that said, like, be inspired, you know, speak from God, you know, like that when you're talking about the silence and you should only speak when inspired. So be inspired with your action. Don't just do what we did 30 years ago.
Yeah, I want to jump in because I was privileged. I want to thank you know, Dave for inviting me into his process of doing this, and I got, of course, got very caught up in it. One of the things that impressed me, that of the many things that I hadn't known before, was the way, in a sense, that Quakers, the early Quakers, really brought the Enlightenment in force into the religion of the day. Moliere, Dave told me, was very inspired by the work of the Quakers to bring equality, human dignity, rationalizing the relationship between men and women, and on and on. And I think that that this movement has certainly grown exponentially. I mean, today our world is, we just take for granted, or at least a lot of us do, so many of the things that and attitudes and thoughts that people were being hung for in you know, back in the 1600s. But I think that the thing that continues to the question I continue to have is the idea of this inspiration that the Quaker movement was combining a sense of enlightened egalitarianism and liberty and all of these values of the Enlightenment that we cherish, with a spiritual inspiration, with a sense of the transcendent. And this is the sort of right brain thing that I was talking about in the left brain, right brain, that McGilchrist feels that our great hope in escaping the tyranny of rationalism is in right brain grasp of transcendence, an experience of life as we live it that is transcendent, and that there's a here and now spiritual power that makes us willing to die for the truth that we are sensing intuitively. And this is a huge question of how do we get this back? You know, how do we recover this? And I think all people, you know, look back to earlier days and say, oh, you know, here was this great inspiration of the founders of the religion, or the founders of the movement, whatever it is, and subsequent generations are wondering, where did it go, and how do we get it back? But I'm always reminded of, you know, the line from that poem, you know, the Second Coming, that says, you know, the worst are filled with passionate intensity, but the best lack all conviction. And I think that, you know, my prayer is that we can get back that conviction, that power, that sense that there's a higher power, that's a reality or truth that's inspiring us in a way that you know, we need in order to match the passionate intensity of the worst among us who are threatening us.
You know, one thing that is not necessarily right brain, George, but maybe more left brain in terms of the Quakers, is the American Friends Service Committee and the Friends Committee on National Legislation has, they created these organizations that I don't know exactly what the relationship is to the, because the Quakers don't have a hierarchy, but it was started by the Quakers and it has had a huge impact on our country. Without, I believe the American Friends Service Committee, they were the ones that began the force behind the nuclear freeze movement, the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy. I believe they had something to do with the American Civil Liberties Union, but they were the impetus for starting the organizations today that protect so much of our civil liberties and our right for to protest and for oppose war and violence. And I learned that the American Friends Service Committee works and has worked for decades in North Korea, for example. They go to places where you don't know they're there. They're there doing work that other organizations don't do. Those other faith groups are also in North Korea. But it's just like you discover these things about the Quakers and what they began. And I think it would be a wonderful, I mean, maybe there's a book already written about this, but how they have impacted U.S. civil our civil institutions. And civil society is so important in a country, that having and building up a civil society. That's why this insurrection is not going to work, I believe, is because we have to exercise them, but our civil society is what's going to stand up for this against tearing down the right for democracy.
I would echo what you were saying, Sally, and add that they were also, I believe, very involved in draft counseling during the Vietnam War, and if not initiating it, but they were very, very instrumental in that anti-war movement. And what you're saying about the civil institutions being hopefully the bulwark against what occurred at the Capitol, I hope you're right. And I would just echo what George referred to earlier. People should, if they can, to read the editorial in the New York Times this morning. It was an excellent historical retrospective on both violence at the Capitol, violence regarding voting and elections, and going back to the Reconstruction era and kind of bringing a lot of that information which I didn't know that took place in the South during those decades. It's very informative.
I think in World War I, the people who were jailed because they wouldn't, they opposed the war, they wouldn't fight, they wouldn't respond to the draft. Those were many different faith groups, but the Quakers were, I believe, sort of the core, in many ways, the core of that, the strength and the courage to go up against a whole country when they go to war. It's very, very difficult. When that fervor moves, that just unites everybody into violence.
Dave, I think it would be a great idea if you did a sequel, and maybe we'll talk about it at the Worship Guild, to follow through with this and bring us up into modern time. All the things that Sally and Mike and everybody have been talking about, and George, in terms of, you know, what we've learned, and what Quakers are still doing. And so let's talk about that at Worship Guild. I think that'd be great, because this is terrific today.
Thank you. Sure. And I might not be the one that's most qualified to deliver that, because so far, I mean, now I'll start, but so far I mean, I can't even remember the name of the guy that was really instrumental in having the Quakers, you know, give up their slaves in America. But that's sort of the 1830s is kind of where I stopped.
Yeah.
So I haven't gotten past there yet.
Well, maybe it should be like a 3-part or a 4-part thing, you know, and maybe, you know, it can be more collaborative. You don't have to carry the whole burden on your shoulders. Let's talk about it.
Sounds
I mean,
good.
this part has been so interesting. It just feels like, I don't know, maybe this is just
sure.
my personal interest in, you know, the Society of Friends, but yeah, I'd say let's carry it forward a little bit.
Sounds good. It was John Woolman, by the way, the person I was thinking of, that, you know, that, was very instrumental in convincing the Quakers in America to, you know, give up their slaves and make sure they were taken care of, and to excommunicate any Quaker that refused.
Very good.
I just wanted to mention that when I was executive director of a nonprofit organization in California that was supporting maquiladora worker organizing and organizing against toxic waste dumping in villages in Mexico, there was a coalition effort all along the border of similar efforts, and the American Friends Service Committee was really at the heart of that. And so I had the pleasure of working with a number of people from American Friends Service Committee who were just, you know, extremely dedicated to ending that injustice.
The trouble is that Unitarians can't sit in a Friends meeting for too long because they want to talk.
But Ruth, what you were describing about the silence, what my sister always told me is when she would go to the Quaker meetings, the silence would be appropriately broken by anybody that felt like they had something to say. I never heard about it being supposedly motivated by the divine, motivating somebody to say something from God.
That's because this was the old tradition. In other words, people whose Quaker roots go back to colonial times,
Okay.
carry that tradition. And because it was a Christian oriented to begin with, and then of course branching out from, as Dave was telling us, but the roots were in, the thing of God. I had asthma at one point when I was having my crisis of faith when I was, 22 or something. I married at 21. So I guess I was 22 or 23. And I was very impressed, with her complete devotion to her faith. And so I had asked her, could she please tell me something about her belief in God? And help me, to understand, because I was losing it. And she said to me, Ruthie, I think of God as the spirit of love that unites us all. And I think that is so Quaker, it really is. It's like, it's not some spirit, up in the sky. It's just the spirit of love that unites us all. And I kind of put that in the back of my brain, but I didn't know how to use it. I just sort of, it sat there for a long time. Until I reconnected actually with the Unitarian Church, which was in 2002. So there you go.
That it still begs for me the question of how do we connect in this today with that spirit of love in a way that is more powerful, more passionate. and gives that joy and that willingness to give up everything for the mission of equality and freedom and so on. I mean, it's and I think part of what some of us are saying is that there are a lot of people who do get there, but to a greater or lesser degree. But I guess for myself, I'm still wanting more, and and I think that we're these times that we're in are like a civil war, and it's going to put pressure on us, so to speak, to dig deeper, I think, into the roots of our own spirituality in order to, deal with the demands that are going to be made on us, perhaps in the years ahead.
Well, one of the secrets might be in what Dave was saying about how the first time you doff the hat, you get a certain amount of joy. Then you up the ante, you get more joy. I think that reminds me of like the first time you ever go to a protest and you're scared and you feel out of place, you feel like a fish out of water or whatever. The second time it's easier, the third time or whatever, it's like the more you do, the more you get joy. And I think maybe the Quakers might have discovered that.
That's good.
I also think, I mean, I don't know if I can land this, but like, so I've been to some protests. I certainly haven't been to as many as Sally or probably all of you. But I feel, and hopefully that'll change, whatever, but I feel that even in little things like seemingly inconsequential things, like if there's this pressure to do X, Y, or Z, and it's just easy to just check that off the list and just get it done. But something inside you is like, just wait. And when I've waited, when that thing inside me says, wait, it's like something else comes along. I'm like, oh, this is much better. And I'm so happy that I didn't just rush into it. And I feel that also has something to do with it. And I feel, and I almost feel like it's practice. Like, so maybe one day I will be more, out in public and, be engaged in protests or making decisions that are really world important, but almost there's like a gearing up to that where, well, can you follow that inspiration just in the little things, and be willing to kind of endure that, like, I want to just check this off the list, but something tells me wait, and then you sort of realize, oh, I should trust this voice, this light, whatever you want to hear it. So I don't know how that sounds to people, but that's sort of how I engage with these ideas.
Yeah.
David, it sounds to me like it's about maturity, like we're impulsive when we're young. We kick chairs, we don't mean to, we're rambunctious. And as we mature, in whatever way that is, whether we're an old soul at 18 or an old soul or a young soul at 75, pacing and listening, waiting for that. When I was 16, the Quakers hired me. They were like my first bosses. They hired me to come watch the kids while they were in the little church out in the woods. It was really, really remote. I didn't know what the heck I was getting into. And, these beautiful children would frolic and play, and they were in the church being quiet. And then one day they said, you have to come join us. I'm like, you're paying me to. So I came in and I sat there as a young girl, and from a Roman Catholic sort of hippie church background where everyone's playing music, it's much more Unitarian than the churches here. And I had that experience of waiting with them, and then someone would rise, say something, and I don't remember if I did it. I don't know, but I was just sort of I was observing, but I was in the middle of it, right in the middle of it, in this beautiful church with, you know, rustic, very rustic, and it was very much about waiting and feeling things and not being impulsive, which is very hard for me. That's not my nature, so I really respect it. And I'd be curious as to, you know, if Nixon was the Quaker that we know him to be, who other leaders, you know, in whatever realm are Quaker right now, like understanding who they are and what, you know, how they operate in modern society. Mm-hmm.
One tends to think that Richard Nixon left his Quakerism behind him.
Put it mildly.
He grew up in Orange County, California, where it was a conservative bastion. The you know, some of the most conservative organizations grew out of his county, so maybe he was affected by that.
Okay.
Well, we're doing a Quaker meeting. Very unitarian.
Silence, right? For why not?
And in my way, as Diane was also saying, you know, I'm violating all the rules because I keep talking, and I'm not waiting for God to inspire me.
That's why you're Unitarian.
Well, that's the truth, isn't it? But you know, I think it was my mother-in-law's roots that allowed me to join the Unitarian Church, because if I had not had, you know, her modeling, I don't know if I would have been open to joining any kind of a religious organization. But and also, by the way, she also was very active with American Friends Service Committee, working in Appalachia as a young woman, driving around in her Model A to, you know, work with poor families. So, you know, this is woven, it's woven into the tradition. And when you're with it that closely, as I was so fortunate to be, you can't help but have some of it enter into your heart. You just can't help it, you know. So anyway, but yeah, you're right, Diane. I think that to have it evidenced, as you know, within the Unitarian Universalist faith is a much better fit for me.
So
I'm also curious about cottagecore. Did anyone know about that? Like cottagecore is this big trend. You know, this is the opposite of Quakerism. Trend is to have these old style clothes, you know, again. My daughter collects them. I mean, there's this whole underpinning, whether the Japanese, wherever you live in the world, that you're buying and living and propagating herbs, and you're trying and making your bread, which again was exploded during COVID, but it was already happening. So this like romanticized version of what it was like to live really hard times, you know. I'm definitely going to ask her, you know, my daughter who's into dressing and interested in, she's studying history. I'm going to ask her to maybe watch your presentation and consider like writing a paper or thinking about that duality of how what we dress expresses and how it keeps us to our mission, whatever it might be, you know, or it doesn't.
I think that's an interesting, but this is Bonnie. I think that's an interesting thought, because will the fashion industry fall? But it can't. But it can't. And yet we see major trends in what is going on in the fashion industry now. As a matter of fact, the new thing is this big capsule closet where you own only a few items of clothing. And we also see the thrift shops overfilled with things that people are getting rid of, and these trends. But to romanticize a time that was so hard to live just amazing to me that people want to go back. Yeah, let's go back to when women had no rights and blacks had no rights. And, you know, it's an utterly ridiculous thing to kind of romanticize that and make that sound like the good old days when in fact they were really hard times. And what the Quakers went through reminds me very much of Gandhi, actually. And I guess really any leaders of any faith and any movement towards equality and justice, it just seems like it has reoccurred over and over and over through human history. So it was almost like hearing the same story told, but maybe with a different colored lens or something.
Absolutely. It reminds me, so in 2 weeks, as I mentioned, Sally and my friend Ted Hall, who is, not Sally, but Ted Hall is a member of the Baha'i faith. But when you read about their history, it reads very similar to Quaker history. You know, the difference is, you know, Quakers were taking the Bible and saying, you guys have it all wrong, and you need this inner light that presupposed the Bible to understand it. And, you know, what's his name again? The Bab, they called him. He was saying, like, you're reading the Quran wrong. And by some accounts, tens of thousands of them were killed. Other accounts, I believe, say one or, you know, at least 1,000 or 2,000. But it was similar. And the Iranian government at the time was wed with Islam, and so it was the Islamic government that killed the early Baha'i followers and persecuted them, just as it was the Puritan and then later the Anglican government that, you know, persecuted and the Quakers. So yeah, no, I agree, Bonnie, and I just made that connection and figured I'd mention it to, I don't know, to keep this in mind for 2 weeks from now. And it's super interesting that this is all this happens everywhere.
Which brings us close to the
Wait, I didn't hear that, which brings us what?
No, that was me turning something off that was, that was in another window, sorry.
Well, that's funny. It said, which brings us, so I thought, okay.
It said, yes, which brings us close to, shut it down.
Yeah, I'm heading out. I wasn't sure if people saw this note about Terry Troya and the was it Community United for Respect and Trust, and NAACP are going to be down on Highland Boulevard today at 4:30 for a vigil and walk because of some anti-Semitism display down on Highland Boulevard, I believe. I don't know the details of that, but I just wanted to share that with you if you hadn't seen it.
Going to be at 4:30 tonight?
Yes, it's at 4:30 and I can post the details in the chat.
I just put them there, Mary. I don't,
Oh, okay.
I copied them from the NAACP post. Is that the right place?
Yes, that's the right place.
Okay. And Highland Boulevard is spelled wrong there, but y'all know what I'm talking about.
And there's a poster on our UU church Facebook page.
Okay, all right. All right.
Where is 2627? That's at just past Newdorf?
Somewhere in New York.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Sally.
Very much.
Mike, it's at the corner of Highland and Beach.
Beach, I couldn't think of the name. Okay,
Mhm.
thank you. I'm not sure if I'll get there, but good to know where it is. All right. I'm gonna go.
Nice to see everybody.
Here, you too, Diane. Bye, Mike. Lewis just raised his hand, so if anyone's staying, Lewis, what do you got? What do you got for us?
Where did he go?
Connecting to audio. I guess you can raise your hand before you're connected to audio. This makes it more Quaker. We're waiting in the silence. Louis, you raised your hand, or was that? Oh, he's still connecting. I thought he was up. He's having technical difficulties.
Hmm.
Oh.
I'm going to have to leave also, but thank you so much, Dave. This was really good. And sorry to take up so much of the talking time, but it's, you brought a lot of stuff back for me today. So,
Yeah,
anyway.
thanks for hearing. I didn't realize you were so close to it. That's cool.
Yeah, big influence in my life. Okay, so bye everybody. See you next week.
Bye. See you.
Belong.
Yeah, I mean, we could go too, or I kind of like the idea of like waiting a little bit, like letting that silence, because then maybe something will be there before you just rush off just because 6 seconds of silence, that means it's time to go, right? I mean, it wouldn't be a Quaker service if we didn't, at least those that are here, if you want to, at least take a minute, right?
Happy birthday. Thank you.
Whose birthday is it?
Sorry about that. It's my husband's birthday.
James,
Oh,
yeah.
happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
I feel moved to say, this is Bonnie, I feel moved to say that this was a great discussion, and thank you so much for doing this, Dave, because that information that I was not aware of, and so many people brought so much to this discussion that it makes me want to know more. So I think the best discussions do make us want to know more, and this is a great topic to follow through with, and how this is a untold story and a continuing story. So, and how it affects all of us. So this was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for being here and being part of it. And those who
Yeah,
already left.
Thank you. And Bonnie, that reminds me, after George spoke 2 weeks ago, there was some talk, which I think George might've been the one that volunteered it. People said there are a few thoughts of the same. This was a great discussion. And George said, hey, let's do it again. We can do it every week. And George and I were in touch about getting that together. And maybe, like at the time it was this idea of talking about right, left brain, but now we're talking about this. This is a great discussion. But anyway, that just puts that in my mind of like, a weekly discussion group, maybe, because I enjoy these discussions, and I don't know, it's something I neglected. I told George I'd bring it up at the last Worship Guild meeting, and it didn't happen. So maybe I'll bring it up at the next one. Because it sounds like George and people. I think when you brought it up a couple weeks ago, people were interested, and Bonnie, I don't know if you'd be interested, but I'm sure. If there's a few of us.
I think that's a great idea. Maybe an additional Zoom meeting every week to discuss things that maybe are not necessarily specifically on target with what the service was about. And it also, if it was later in the week or whatever, it would give us time to mill things over and think about it and come back with more questions or more information. So.
Yeah, sort of like a Zoom salon, it could be fun, It could be...
Yeah, absolutely. Another way to connect and to get inspiration and discuss matters. Sounds wonderful. Well, I do have to bow out now. So I doff my hat to you all because we all are at the same level. So I'm doffing my hat to all of you, and you all have. Thank you.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Mary, you're muted. You're muted.
I said I have to run too. Thank you very much, Dave, and everybody who participated.
Sure thing. Good to see you. Bye. All right, George, you and I are the only faces here, although there's four.
Well, I've got to run too, Dave, so why don't we wrap it up?
So maybe since you're the last face to everyone else is just
Oh,
audio. Oh,
my wife wants to.
I loved your talk.
Oh, that was.
Here I am. I'm over here.
Thank you.
She's here.
I loved your talk. It was very informative. And I not only was it informative, but you did a really admirable job of presenting the work. You instilled just the right amount of passion, of enthusiasm, and of knowledge. So I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to your husband for carrying that out. What's that?
A good balance of left brain and right brain. Very well done.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh no, the dog's trying to eat my little lunch here. All right, I've got to get back to work. We're working on a food pantry.
Food meal.
All right, George. Take care. Good to see you.
Food meal. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks again.
If anyone else, take care. Yeah. God bless. If anyone else that I see are still on, have anything else to say, I guess now's the time. Otherwise, catch you all later. Thanks for coming and great discussion, everybody. And see you next time. So long.